first one is this velocity of money concept. It's the same as, all right, so let's take a look at this short video about the velocity of money. I think they explain it with visuals a little better than I could do.
Today we're going to introduce an important tool for thinking about issues in macroeconomics, the quantity theory of money. Let's imagine the journey a dollar bill might take in a year. Imagine that the dollar bill starts with Tyler, who buys a pupusa from Don, the street vendor. Don gives it to his daughter, who spends it on a pony ride at the fair. It ends up in the hands of Alex, who after losing it and then finding it in his couch cushions, buys a cup of coffee while on a road trip to see his favorite polka band. So in a year, this dollar has been spent 3 times on the pupusa, the pony ride, and on a cup of coffee. Okay, we've got the building blocks to understand the quantity theory of money already. Our dollar bill, well, that's money, which we represent with the letter M. How many times that dollar gets used in a year is called the velocity of money, which we'll label with a V. In this case, V is 3, as our bill was spent 3 times in a year. The pupusa, pony ride, and coffee are real goods and services, which we'll call Y. And the price of those goods and services we'll call P. These are the variables in the quantity theory of money. Now, let's think about this for an economy as a whole. M would be the money supply, all the money in the economy. V would be how many times a dollar is spent purchasing finished goods and services. Some people hoard cash under their mattress, so their dollars have a low velocity, while others spend or invest their money quickly and their dollars have a high velocity. V is the number of times the average dollar is spent. P would be the price level of all finished goods and services in an economy, and Y would be all the finished goods and services sold in an economy. So Y is real GDP, and when you multiply it by a measure of the price level, you get nominal GDP. Same thing over here. You take all our money, M, and multiply it by how many times the average dollar was spent, or V, and you get nominal GDP as well. Both sides represent nominal GDP in a different way. So, these are equal by definition, which is why we call this equation an identity. One way to think about it is that how much money we have in total times how many times the money is spent covers the actions of buyers. The stuff we sell times the prices we charge covers the actions of sellers. Given that everything that is sold is, by definition, bought by someone, this equation is true by definition. There are important questions about the variables and how they are measured. How do we measure M, for example? However, the core identity that M times V must equal P times Y gives us a lot of insight and a way of organizing our thought about important macroeconomic issues. So, we'll return to this tool often. For example, what can this identity equation tell us about the causes of inflation? That's the topic we'll turn to next.
All right, so money times velocity equals price times GDP. MV equals PY. This is a quantity theory of money. We use that for sort of an old-fashioned multiple choice question. We can say, given the constant velocity of money in the short run, a 5% increase in the money supply will translate to a 5% increase in what? A, B, C, D, or E? You're right, it is the nominal gross domestic product, just like the equation says. Let's look at this one for a second. Hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is typically caused by A, B, C, or D, or E. And right again, B, continuous expansion of the money supply to finance government budget deficits. All right, so speaking of budget deficits, government deficits. So although deficits and debt are topics, big topics in the real world, the AP exam actually doesn't ask very many questions about them, which is good for you guys. What you do need to understand really is just what it means, what they are, what causes them, and their impact on future spending. You don't really have to know anything about the facts about the budget or facts about debt ratios, or you don't have to know any opinions, have any opinions about them. Just sort of understand what they are, what causes them, and their impact on future spending. So we're looking at policies. Every policy has a trade-off. So what's the trade-off of increasing government spending without raising taxes to close the recessionary gap. Deficit spending. So deficit spending, you can have a budget deficit. It's when the annual government spending and transfer payments are greater than what they take in the tax revenue. Or you can have the opposite, a budget surplus. Don't see very often, is when annual government spending and transfer payments are less than what they take in the tax revenue. And the national debt then is the accumulation of all these budget deficits over time. And so if the government increases spending without increasing taxes, they will increase the annual deficit and the national debt. So they're intertwined, the deficit and the debt. So to understand that, we have to understand what is included in the budget. And the budget has something called entitlements. Entitlements are a federal program that requires payments to any eligible person or unit of government. So this is mandatory spending, stuff that must be paid. For example, Social Security. The three big ones actually are Social Security, Medicare, and Medi-Cal. But there were smaller ones, unemployment, retirement programs for federal employees, student loans. But the big ones are Social Security, Medicare, and Medi-Cal. We can see here the chart, if we look over time, the concern we have is that the discretionary spending, which is the annual budget stuff, things that change over time, is getting smaller and smaller. The mandatory programs, the entitlement programs are getting larger and larger. So we see in 2012, it was 58%. It's discretionary spending, 36%. And the interest that we pay is 6%. And the problem is, if the national debt goes up, then the money we pay on the interest will get larger and larger and larger, will become a larger percentage of the pie. And that can't come from mandatory programs, so it has to come from discretionary spending. And so that will get smaller. And we see this, we can see what the national debt is doing by looking at this great website, the US Debt Clock. And I know some people have seen this in class. You've probably seen it in government class if you're a senior. And it's always going up. It has been for a long time. It's interesting to see the numbers here. You can click on a few of these and get to some other numbers. And you can look at this also by country. Three numbers we're looking at, though, are the US national debt here over in the left currently. And I took this today. The 23rd of April. It's at 24, is that trillion? Million, billion, trillion, 24 trillion, 24.5 trillion. Also need to understand the US federal debt to GDP ratio. So is the federal debt to our GDP? So it's the federal debt to GDP. And it's going up from today, from the 80s. In the 80s, it was 35%, and that's 58. Now it's 114, which means our debt is larger than our GDP. The other one number we look at sometimes is to look at the total debt, including like consumer debt, all the other debt, to GDP ratio, and that's higher. It's even higher, 130%. And so those are the numbers that are often talked about in the news. All right, the last concept is this concept of crowding out. Crowding out. It used to come on the exams, but that's when we had lots of multiple choice questions. So it might be there. We don't have many choices on this new exam, but it's good to understand this concept of crowding out. It's pretty simple. It really just means that deficit spending leads to higher interest rates, which then crowds out private investment and consumption. So crowding out, and we have to look at the loanable funds market. Loanable funds market here you can see with a real interest rate. You can see a supply and demand for loans, it's loanable funds. So assume the government increases deficit spending. What will happen to the demand for loanable funds? If they increase deficit spending, they're spending more. Demand for loanable funds and the real interest rate and private domestic investment. Well, it's definitely going to go up as they need more loans for their deficit. So demand for more loans, that's going to increase. The real interest rate then therefore increases. And with the real interest rate increasing, private investment decreases. Going down. So that gap here is the difference between what the government is taking out. They're demanding this much more. And so that reduces the quantity that the private investment is going to get. It's sort of being crowded out. The rest of this here to the right, between quantity private and quantity two is what the government, these are the government loans, what the government is taking out, the demand by the government. The total number of loans increased to Q2, but that was due to public borrowing. So private borrowing decreased down as we, I got ahead of myself, as it decreased down to quantity of private one. So in the long, what is the long run impact of higher interest rates? Well, higher interest rates means less economic growth, investment will fall, less capital stock. And that is what crowding out is. It's the adverse effect of government borrowing on the interest-sensitive private sector spending. If the government borrows more, interest rates go up, private sector gets pushed out, crowded out. All right, a couple of quick questions. Crowding out refers to the decrease in. Clearly C, private investment due to increased borrowing by the government. And the final one, an increase in the government budget deficit is most likely to result in an increase in which of the following? And it's real interest rate. All right, that is the last slide for today. I'm going to post some FRQ questions for you for practice that we'll go over next class. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.